Joy on the streets of Seoul after South Korea's president is impeached. But will people power remedy the nation's track record for corruption? Also, the number of residents who have fled from Mosul tops 100,000. The head of the UN's Refugee Agency in Iraq tells us they're not ready for the influx. And dying while the world watches on. Cries of despair from Aleppo amid reports the Syrian regime is attacking residents in rebel-held areas. I'm Imran Garza, and this is the Newsmakers. For months, South Koreans filled the streets demanding their president go. And on Friday, they finally got their wish when Parliament overwhelmingly voted to impeach her. But that move was only the beginning. The Constitutional Court now has up to 6 months to decide whether she stays or leaves. Judges will examine her finances, ties to corporations, and her relationship with a friend charged with fraud and meddling in state affairs. Critics of the ousted leader say the scandal is only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to government wrongdoing. Today's newsmaker is South Korea's President Park Geun-hye, as we ask whether her impeachment will be enough to put an end to a culture of corruption in the nation's politics.
In a wave of peaceful protests, South Koreans have voiced their anger at the president and the political system, turning the tide on Park Geun-hye. They were outraged by revelations she allowed her friend Choi Soon-sil, an unelected individual with ties to a religious cult, to influence speeches and policy. But protesters were inflamed about allegations Choi used her ties to the president for financial gain. Choi has been indicted on charges of abuse of power, fraud and coercion for pressuring corporations like Samsung to donate about $70 million to foundations she controlled. Public prosecutors have accused Park of colluding in the corruption scandal. She denies any wrongdoing, but the damage to her political legacy has been done. She's now the second president to be impeached. The motion was carried by 234 votes to 56, with members of her own Sainuri party voting against her. The Constitutional Court has up to 180 days to uphold or dismiss the motion. President Park will keep her title for now, but she's been stripped of her powers. Prime Minister Hwang Kyo-ahn has become the acting president. And many see the impeachment as an important step towards changing South Korea's culture of influence and corruption. Modern South Korea rose from the ashes of war to become an Asian economic powerhouse. Park Geun-hye's father, the dictator Park Chung-hee, played a key role. He openly encouraged family-run businesses known as chaebols to dominate and monopolize industries to grow the economy. And they did. Chaebol is a combination of two words, wealth and clan. Samsung, LG and Hyundai are some of these sprawling family-run corporations with businesses across society. You can buy a Samsung phone, live in a Samsung flat and get treatment at a Samsung hospital. Park Geun-hye pledged to curb the influence of these companies and to fight corruption. Yet this scandal has put a spotlight on the ties between the political and business elite. For the first time in nearly 30 years, the heads of the largest chaebols have been forced to face an antagonistic parliament to answer questions about donations and how they deal with the nation's top office. The protesters showed the public wants a new way of doing politics. But when the nation elects a new president next year, will South Korea be in a position to change it? Natalie Pohonen, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from New York is Hyun Lee. She's an activist with the Solidarity Committee for Democracy and Peace in Korea. She's also a fellow at the Korea Policy Institute. And from Seoul, Se-Woong, he's the managing editor of news magazine Korea Expose. Thank you, both of you, for joining us. Se-Woong, let me start with you. People are celebrating on the streets because of this impeachment. Presumably, the vast majority of Koreans are delighted by this.
Well, indeed, if you look at the numbers running up to the impeachment vote last Friday, we were looking at about 80% of the electorate professing support for the idea of impeaching the president. And even after the vote took place, we're still seeing protests taking place here in Seoul, with people calling for the president to actually step down immediately in order to spare the country weeks of uncertainty that might result from just waiting for the Constitutional Court to rule on the validity of this impeachment vote. So it is correct to say that many people are delighted, but they're also looking to see what's going to happen in the weeks and months that will follow this moment.
Geun-hye, is that what you want? Do you want her to step down so that your country doesn't have to go through that whole process through the Constitutional Court, which could take up to 6 months?
Yes, of course. Everyone knows that her days are numbered. But Park Geun-hye refuses to step down precisely because she knows that if she does, that will lead to her immediate arrest and possible prosecution. And she is holding on in the Blue House, where she is immune from being arrested and being subject to an investigation. The special prosecutor's mandate to investigate the corruption scandal involving her confidant, that ends in March. So if the Constitutional Court, many of the judges there are appointees of the current president, if they can delay the ruling until March, they may spare her from at least the embarrassing scenario of her being led out of the Blue House in handcuffs.
Geun-hye, were you protesting or were you against her because she was corrupt along with her inner circle, or do you want change because you believe the entire system's corrupt?
Yes, well, the foreign media, I think, should be made aware that the outpouring of anger on the streets in South Korea in recent months is not only a spontaneous reaction to the very sensationalized government corruption scandal involving the so-called shamanist confidant of the president. It is actually the outpouring of pent-up frustration from many years of Park Geun-hye's rule. A lot of people around the world think that South Korea is a modern democracy, but I think many people in South Korea believe that her rule was very reminiscent of the very autocratic style of her father, who was a military dictator who ruled for 2 decades. The first thing she did when she took office was to dissolve an opposition political party. This is unheard of in modern democracies. She jailed opposition leaders. She introduced a state-authored history textbook to be taught in public schools. These are things that actually take South Korea backwards in time. Mm-hmm. And this is, the mass protests were in fact a coming together of various sectors of society who have been protesting against her anti-democratic policies for many years. That's including workers who are fighting against privatization, farmers who are fighting against free trade agreements and rice imports that have devastated the country's agricultural sector. And they are now coming together, and what they're demanding is not only the ouster of the president, but also a dissolution of the institutions that made her rule possible.
Let me ask Se-Woong, do you agree that we got it wrong from the outside? We see South Korea as a model of democracy, for development, the free market. And maybe, did we get it wrong because we're just maybe comparing South Korea to your northern neighbor and anybody looks good compared to North Korea?
I think certainly having North Korea as a neighbor has helped South Korean political establishment a great deal for many years. Just by saying that here you have a very autocratic system just north of the border, we can say that whatever happens in South Korea is not as bad, so people must make sacrifice and accept the choices that are being offered by the political establishment. That has been the argument, actually, that we have heard for many, many years from the conservatives, and that is the argument that is being undone today. So I think Geun-hye made a very good point when she talked about how people outside South Korea doesn't quite realize to what extent people here think of the country as a kind of an autocratic, backward country. In fact, some people even go so far as to argue that modern Korea is similar to a feudal monarchy than a democracy.
Okay.
And this is something that, this is something we need to think about. Because I think the mistake is in thinking that when a country democratizes, when it reaches a certain point of having this democratic system, that democracy endures. What we have seen, unfortunately, over the last two presidential administrations with Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye is that these rulers or these leaders have tried very hard to undo many of the rights that were gained in the course of democratization in 1987, including the maneuvers that Geun-hye just discussed, and also just trying to curtail overall people's freedom to assemble, to make demands, and to really participate in democracy in a meaningful way.
Right.
And right now, what we see with these protests in the streets is not just about the scandal or some salacious elements about a shaman. It's more about really people coming together to make concerted democratic demands toward a government that for a very long time has been acting in a highly authoritarian manner.
Yeah, both of you have made a good point, because a lot of us looked at this with Choi Soon-sil as some sort of Rasputin-like character, and we thought this might just be focused on that, but it's clear that this is much broader than that. Okay, let me address the first of the final two things I want to address with you, Geun-hye. The party itself, given that many members of her own party voted to impeach her, does that mean that the party is now gone, it's dead, it's in huge trouble because it's been ripped apart?
Yes, so the moderate section of the Conservative Hennedy Party will now try to reorganize the party. They will dissolve the existing party. They will create a new party with a new name, a new branding, to try to appeal to their conservative base for the next presidential election, which will be held within 2 months after the president steps down. The KiMoons, whose term as the Secretary General of the UN will end at the end of this month, he will presumably go back to South Korea to try to join forces with this section of the Conservative Party to try to rebuild the party. And that is probably the scenario that the people in the U.S. that have a vested interest in preserving the U.S.-ROK alliance, that is the scenario that they probably want.
Se-Woong, final question for you. If someone like Ban Ki-moon returns and runs, are you confident that that would signal a corruption-free or corruption-less future for the country?
Well, that would be a nice thing to see, but I don't think Ban Ki-moon's election is really going to signal a meaningful change for South Korea. What he's being brought in here to South Korea to be is to present this outsider figure. South Koreans have often been swayed by people who are perceived to be outside forces as the presidential candidates.
Okay, I hate to wrap when things just about get interesting, but unfortunately we are out of time. Geun-hye and Se-Woong, thank you very much for giving us your insights and analysis. Good to have you on the program. Hope to have you on the program again in the not too distant future. Bye-bye. As the battle to retake the Iraqi city of Mosul from Daesh rages on, civilians caught in the crossfire are fleeing by the day. The Iraqi government now says more than 100,000 people have been displaced since the start of the fighting, and there are concerns aid agencies won't be able to cope. Could this fuel the next wave of the global refugee crisis? The Newsmakers' Christine Provalakis reports.
These are the people trapped in the city of Mosul, fighting for survival. It's been several weeks since Iraqi forces and an international coalition launched the operation to retake Daesh's last major stronghold in Iraq. They have made gains on several fronts. But Daesh has still refused to surrender. The army has had to dodge car bombs, sniper fire, and ambushes launched from a network of Daesh tunnels.
تقريبا ماكو امين نروح نظل هنا ماكو والله خاف ليش ما قلت ما خاف تخوف شويه هاونات تقع خاف طلقات عندنا اطفال يخافون بالليل يبكون.
And the presence of more than 1 million civilians throughout the city has posed challenges, reducing their options for using airstrikes and heavy weapons in densely populated streets. Daesh still occupies 3/4 of Mosul, depriving residents of electricity, food, and water, and shooting anyone that tries to escape. But for those who have, their new reality isn't much brighter. The United Nations says close to 84,000 displaced people are being housed in camps near eastern Mosul. But they're running out of room for new arrivals and are desperate for aid. Over the past year, Iraqi troops and allied forces have pushed Daesh from most of the vast Sunni province of Anbar west of Baghdad and areas north and east of the Iraqi capital. But the humanitarian fallout has been dire. On top of Mosul's crisis, Iraq is already dealing with 3.1 million internally displaced people since the campaign against the militant group began in 2014. The summer battle to force Daesh from the city of Fallujah forced more than 60,000 people out in just 3 days. Overwhelming aid workers who raced against the clock to prepare additional camps to prevent overcrowding. And as winter sets in across northern Iraq, aid agencies worry that funding isn't coming in fast enough to keep up. The UN's Refugee Agency says it needs $584 million this year to deal with the influx of internally displaced people. But so far, it has only received $249 million, or 43% of that, of which $196 million is needed just for the Mosul emergency response. As relief agencies continue to be stretched to their limit. The UN says it is now preparing for a potential exodus of 700,000 people from Mosul. And with the threat of violence spilling into neighboring areas, a dark question overshadows the plight of Iraq's displaced residents. Where will they flee to next? Christine Pirovolakis, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now is the head of the UNHCR in Iraq, Bruno Geddo. Thanks so much for joining us, sir. There are reports that if Mosul is retaken, up to 700,000 people will be displaced. Does that sound reasonable to you? Does that sound like a correct ballpark figure?
That is our own planning figure. The planning figure of the United Nations for Mosul is, in the worst case scenario, 700,000 people. The issue is, how are we going to meet this need for shelter? And it is here that the nuances have to be made. The first one is that the maximum capacity we have between now and March next year will be something like 30,000 plots multiplied by 6 is 180,000 people. We can increase this capacity up to 75,000 plots, that is multiplied by 6, 470,000 people. But still we will not be able to meet that figure of 700,000. How then can the water find its level? There are two possibilities here. One is that the people who have already come out from the city, as their neighborhoods are being declared safe for return, are starting to return. Second, and most important, there is an institution in Iraq called sponsorship, meaning that displaced people from Mosul can be sponsored by relatives, by tribesmen, by entrepreneurs, to move elsewhere in the country to join family members or to move to a religious shrine or to move to a farm to pick fruit. And therefore, if they are allowed to be sponsored out of the camps, additional spare capacity will be created, and therefore we could accommodate the fresh outflow. The challenge is that we don't know when, and that is why we need to prepare more camps to be ready to receive more people. The situation is going into a long-term siege. We don't know when the cork will pop, but when the cork pops, we may be overwhelmed if we are not prepared to receive a much bigger number of people.
In an earlier interview, you said that you don't want to have the same situation as Fallujah. That's why you want to be prepared. It made me curious. How do you feel you failed when it came to Fallujah?
We failed because we didn't see the cork popping. In Fallujah, there was pent-up pressure to free, but ISIS was able to keep people inside the city. They were being executed, fired at if they were trying to flee. All of a sudden, a military position was taken off, and an opening was made, and there was a mass outflow, 65,000 people in 3 days. Result, the UN was not prepared to receive them, and some of them went for many days without shelter, and which for a humanitarian worker is very bad, and we felt very bad about this. We are determined not to repeat the same mistake. Donors are helping us because donors now are funding us to prepare. In the case of Fallujah, we had no funds to prepare. We had to use all the money that was at our disposal, but that was not enough to set up all the camps necessary to receive these people. The challenge here is that Mosul is likely to be as much as 10 times bigger than Fallujah. So it will still be a major issue for us to be able to respond, even as we are trying our best to prepare, and we have some funds to do so.
If the cork pops, as you say, right now, do you have enough money to deal with the situation and the people who will be scattered as a result?
We have 40,000 tents available. That is not a small figure. Each tent can house 6 people, so it would make for 240,000 people, 160,000 people, sorry. But then there are the tents also put at the disposal by the Ministry of Migration. So the capacity in terms of tents is available. The issue is that we do not have enough land to put the tents on.
Final question for you, sir. What would you deem success? If we spoke again in a month's time, what would be deemed success in your eyes?
I mean, to me, the success I'm looking for, in the short term, of course, if there is a large-scale outflow, the success will be if we manage to provide shelter, food and water within 24 hours of arrival. That is the first line of response, life-saving assistance. But the longer-term success, we need to make sure that civilians feel protected and respected. This, hopefully, will help counter the narrative of ISIS that out there are your enemies, and give a perspective to those who lived and suffered in Mosul for the last 2 years, that at the end of the day, they may have a place in the future Iraqi polity.
Bruno Ghetto, good to talk to you. Thank you very much for joining us. Have we just witnessed Syria's Srebrenica? Did a massacre just unfold in eastern Aleppo before our very eyes? As the Syrian regime crushes the last remaining sliver of land held by the opposition, social media is bearing witness to atrocities committed against dozens of civilians. The UN says it's gravely concerned about reports of mass killings and torture. Online, there's been one resounding question. How did the world allow this to happen? These are the voices from Aleppo, and these might be their last words.
نحن في حلب نتذبح، نحن في حلب جائعين، نحن في حلب نقضي الويل، أطفالنا تذبح، نساؤنا انهارت أعصابنا، ما في عنا أي شيء من أسباب الحياة. أين أنتم؟ أنجدونا.
Final message. I'm very sad no one is helping us in this world. No one is evacuating me and my daughter. Goodbye.
I guess it's goodbye. Thanks to all who stood for us and paid for us. But it's almost over and they're just hours away from killing us.
I just woke up shaking a few minutes ago. Someone was sitting on my doorhouse screaming, "Help! Does anyone has a car here? Help! People are pieces."
I would like to thank all the humans who stood for the humanity with our case. I will never forget you if we pass to the other line.
Don't believe anymore in United Nations. Don't believe anymore in the international community. Don't think that they are not satisfied with what's going on. They are satisfied that we are being killed, that we are facing one of the most difficult or the most serious or the most horrible massacre that is in the new history. I hope you can remember us. I don't know. Thank you very much.
Unbelievably touching and disturbing going through some of those tweets from the residents of Aleppo. Next time on the Newsmakers, we'll have special coverage of the assault on Aleppo. That's all for this edition. I'm Imran Garda. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.